My name is Gerda Sanders. On behalf of the Women's Week Committee, I welcome you to today's event, a keynote address by Dr. Julianne Malveax on this year's theme, Motherhood Matters, Challenges, Complications, and New Definitions. We chose this theme to continue the UW's Women's Week tradition of celebrating women's achievement while thinking about the work that must still be done. Motherhood has come a long way since being the major prescribed role for women over many centuries. However, as families evolve and the traditional family gives way to step-families and other coalitions, single-parent families become the norm rather than the exception. Many women decide not to become mothers. Gays and lesbians openly raise children. Ethnic demographics change, and the gap between rich and poor grows wider. Motherhood is indeed challenged and complicated in new ways. So far in Women's Week, we've explored methamphetamine addiction among Utah mothers through a spy hop documentary titled Mother Superior. We have also held the Mommy Monologues, where community members and faculty explored their varied relations to motherhood that included becoming my mommy's mommy, being a single male parent, parenting a black child in Utah, being judged unfit for adoption because you're gay, and being the mom of a child who has died. Other Women's Week events are still ongoing or coming up. In the Bailey Exhibition Hall at the College of Architecture, artist Alice Perot's work can be seen until the end of the week. Perot's paintings depict her experiences as the mother of Julius, who suffered a lack of oxygen during birth that resulted in major injuries to the brain, and the mother of Cyrus, who died at birth. Our committee chose Perot's painting, Ride, as our poster art for Women's Week. It is a portrait of Perot giving Julius a ride on her back. Perot wrote this about the piece: "You can't carry him around forever. That's what people tell me. But all I have is forever. Anything less is paralyzing. Forever to love him. Forever to lift him. Forever to believe that he embodies the shift that will tilt this world's cruel imbalances. This is our ride." Our closing event will be another keynote tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in the same room. Susan Douglas, the author of The Mommy Myth, The Idealization of Motherhood and How It Undermines Women, will be speaking on the topic of her book. Please note that we're raising money for the Crisis Nursery during all of this week's events. Please visit the table at the back of the room for information on the Family Support Center's Crisis Nursery, which offers free respite childcare 24 hours a day. Please make a donation if you can. And then I sadly have to tell you that the bookstore, King's English, who has a display at the back, sadly was unable to get copies of Dr. Malveax's book since, as Dr. Malveax explains, even though it was published only in 2004, by kind of bookselling terms, it is considered out of print. I do know from experience, though, that you can snag a copy of that from Amazon or other places on the internet, so don't be deterred. And Dr. Malveax also said that if you should contact her website, she has some copies that she would be happy to let you have. So, before we go on with our program, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our new Associate Vice President of Diversity, Octavia Villapando, whose new role was announced today. Octavia, would you just... Welcome, and thank you for coming. I have another pleasant announcement. During this week of looking ahead at the challenges we women still face, we also have a tradition of pausing to celebrate women's accomplishments. We're taking this opportunity to announce this year's winner of the Linda Amos Award for Distinguished Service to the Women of the University of Utah. Donna Hawkshurst, a training coordinator at the Women's Resource Center, will present the award.
Thank you, Gerda. It is my pleasure. I'd like to just hit on a few highlights. It would be very difficult to capture all of them in terms of Kathy's career here at the University of Utah. She was director of the Women's Resource Center from 1989 to 2003. From 1990 to 1992, she was chair of the Child Care Committee, which resulted in the establishment of the Office of Child Care. In 1990, Kathy helped establish an ongoing series of meetings with university presidents on the status of women on campus. In May 1995, the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women was established. Dean Linda K. Amos was named the first chair of that commission. Kathy chaired the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women from 1999 to 2001. She chaired the Task Force on Women in Math, Science, and Engineering and was a key player in establishing the Access Program to recruit and retain women students in math, science, engineering, and health science majors. Through the 1990s, the Women's Resource Center, under Kathy's leadership, worked with other departments in the College of Science and Health Science, along with a group from the Salt Lake Public Schools, to create Expanding Your Horizons, a conference to interest young women in grades 6 through 9 in careers in math, science, engineering, and health sciences. In March 1990, Provost Jim Clayton awarded Kathy Brooks the first funds to establish what would become Women's Week at the university. During the early 1990s, Kathy chaired the Evolving Women's Week Committee, which became an official event out of the Office of Diversity under the leadership of first Dr. Ron Coleman and later Dr. Karen Dace. Safety issues on campus were a major ongoing concern of Kathy's, and she worked with the Campus Safety Committee, the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, the Campus Police, and other campus entities to address and resolve some of these concerns. The annual Walk in the Dark began during this era, spearheaded by the Women's Resource Center, Peers Educating to End Rape, and later the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. Kathy served on the EEO Commission Committee to establish policies and procedures for reporting sexual harassment. In early 2000, Kathy and Karen McGreary joined forces and through the auspices of the Presidential Commission established a leadership training opportunity for women staff members. The needs and issues for women of color on campus, as well as diversity issues in recruiting not only students but faculty, were of major concern to Kathy during her years on campus, as were issues of LGBT students. Kathy was also instrumental in increasing scholarship support for non-traditional students on campus. And I took a few moments to just contact a few people who had worked with Kathy during the years that she was here, and I'd like to just share some quotes from them. First, Linda, I actually suggested to Leo that he invite Linda Amos to come present the award since it's her namesake. She was a former dean of College of Nursing and the first recipient of the Linda K. Amos Award. And I quote, "Kathy has always been a counselor, supporter, and friend to the University of Utah staff, faculty, students, and administration. People have turned to her for insight in dealing with innumerable sensitive and current issues surrounding women in higher education. She was instrumental in developing and maintaining a statewide consortium of women leaders in higher education. That consortium did much to create support and a sense of togetherness for women in higher education in the state of Utah. Kathy's work will have a lasting effect for all of us." And for Dr. Ron Coleman, who couldn't be here today, and he expressed extreme regrets about that, and I quote, "It is especially important that the honor is coming during the Women's Week celebration. Most people do not know that Kathy Brooks is the primary reason we began the annual Women's Week program. It was her idea, and as the Associate Vice President for Diversity, I had the privilege of working with Kathy and Dare Gillespie in launching this activity." From Beverly Fenton, who is currently a pre-professional advisor here at the U and was the former American Indian advisor at CESA, and I quote, "It is tough to choose a few words for someone like Kathy. She's been a friend, a mentor, a defender, and a counselor when I truly would not have been able to keep it together without her sage advice. My fondest memories are the two of us sitting in the University Park Hotel. Each of us ordered one margarita and a glass of iced tea. I think so we weren't tempted to order another margarita, and solve the problems of the day while dining on the happy hour munchies of the day. I can never repay the kindness, patience, and support she has always given me. I'm truly honored to call her friend. And lastly, from Dr. Karen Dace, who is the former Associate Vice President for Diversity, and I quote, "Shortly after I arrived on campus, Kathy Brooks reached out to me. Although she arrived only 1 year prior to me, she had already figured this place out and offered to help me adjust to life in Utah at the University of Utah. Kathy made connections for me both on and off campus, and when I had a medical emergency, it was Kathy Brooks who got me in to see a woman physician when no one in town was accepting new patients. She knows how to be both friend and mentor. I could always count on Kathy to shoot straight from the hip and to do so with compassion, and I think that really sums it up. It is my great pleasure to invite Kathy up to receive the Linda K. Amos Award.
I am so touched.
And you need to open it.
Shall we? All right. I don't want to take a lot of time.
Is there really an award in here, Leo?
Can you grab a bowl like that? All right. Oh, it's beautiful. It'll look nice in Santa Fe.
You need to give it back to be engraved.
All right. Well, we've done that one before, too. Is it safe there for a minute?
I think so.
Okay. I am deeply honored and very touched by the words and the sharing, and as I look at all of you, how important it is to be here and what it meant to walk down memory's lane when I was thinking about this, but what it means to be here. And, you know, I have to tell you that I had a wonderful time at this university. I love being here. I love working here. But I'm even more delighted to look back and look out and know things still are going on. There's a strong, funded Women's Week that is exploring the issues that we exactly intended. Thank you, Herta, for saying the things that you did about the new work and looking at that. That exactly what we intended to have happen. We just had to really work to get it to happen. And to know that it goes on regularly and is established really thrills me. I know that we worked hard to get the GLBT Center. I know that it's now literally moving up and has become a real center. I know that CESA continues to serve students, and we've had our rocky moments over the years in terms of whether that would continue. It's delightful to know that it's healthy and well and serving students again. I cannot tell you how proud I am of gender studies and the work that they've been doing. And as I watched Herta and knew how much her leadership meant to us, Catherine before her, and I talk a lot about Catherine to people who I meet, and Herta now, and the gender studies program that people say is alive in Utah. They're always struck by the fact that we have as many things here as we do, and I am always proud that they are here. The Presidential Commission on the Status of the Woman was a long time coming. There are some funny stories that Linda didn't share, and I'm glad she didn't, about the early years of that commission and how we got it established. But that it continues under Liz Tajian's leadership at this point to be a vital element on the campus and making a difference for the condition of women on this campus, students, staff, faculty, for the campus community whole, is a great pleasure, and I am very proud of that. Last but not least, to walk into the Women's Resource Center, know that it has superb leadership. Know that it is so healthy and so alive and doing such good work. The last month, I've had the opportunity to have lunch in Bernalillo, New Mexico, with 2 of our former practicum students, to talk about the center with them and what it meant to them, to know that the feminist multicultural practicum program is going on and affecting women all over the world, literally, and the women that are coming out and providing those services for clients now is just, it's hard to tell you. You're sitting there in that little funny restaurant in Bernalillo thinking about this and thinking, my goodness, you know, we are making changes, and we are making, and the leadership of that program under Donna, under Christy Bartley now, but certainly under Donna's hard work over the years, I am very, very proud of all of this. My thanks to all of you, and I was recently at a program with Jackson Katz. I went to talk with him. He has done some programs here, and one of our former staff members works with him. And one of the things he reminded all of us, but certainly me at that point, we must not give up. We've not solved the problems of violence to women worldwide. We've not solved all the equity and parity issues for women. We're doing better. It's nice to see a woman who's a mother and a grandmother take the gavel of office in terms of the House. It's nice to see people taking, and to have a viable woman candidate for president. You know, we got a long way to go on this one. The work is not done for any of us. So I wish you well. I wish you lots of luck in the work that you're doing, and to hang in there, be of good spirit, and continue to serve this university in the way that makes it a surprise to people that women in Utah are as strong as they are. It's also fun to watch our women's basketball team here, and I always love to do that. So the Utes and Utah women are very, very close to my heart. My best wishes.
I think I need that. Yeah.
On the website Contemporary Black Biography by the Gale Group, Julianne Malveax describes herself as poet/writer/economist. Given Cornell West's characterization of Dr. Malveax as the most iconoclastic public intellectual in the country, her modest self-description clearly needs unpacking. Poet/writer/economist. It was in poetry that Dr. Malveax first broke into print. She was first published in the late 1960s in the Journal of Black Poetry. Creative writing continues to be one of her passions. She keeps a journal and is working on a novel. However, when she went to college, her focus from the beginning was on economics. After earning a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Dr. Malveax has continued her research on the labor market, public policy, and the impact of policy on women and people of color. She has taught economics, public policy, and African American studies at several of the premier universities in the United States, including the University of San Francisco and the University of California, Berkeley. Yesterday at the Women's Week panel on the clock, we discussed the particular challenges women face in balancing life and work. University of Utah economics professor Nilofer Kagate explained that feminist economics was the analysis of the non-monetary economy. That is, the unpaid labor predominantly performed by women, such as housework, childcare, and elder care. While Dr. Malveax's work clearly falls under the feminist umbrella, she has also brought an economic perspective to problems ranging from AIDS to recycling to racial solidarity. Dr. Malveax even-handed criticism of both conservatives and liberals for their lack of understanding that the real issue is economics has gained her a wider audience in the classroom and other academic venues. A sought-after guest on national television. She has appeared on ABC's Politically Incorrect, PBS's To the Contrary, and the Lira News Hour, CNN and C-SPAN, and many others. In addition to her headline-making analyses on TV, Julianne Malveax has influenced public opinion as a writer. Her syndicated column has appeared in some 20 newspapers across the United States. She is also a regular contributor to USA Today, Ms., Essence, Black Enterprise, Working Women, and Black Scholar. In fact, when I introduced Erica George, a professor on our law faculty, to Julianne Malveax right now, Erica told her that she had been reading her column in Essence since she was a teenager. Dr. Malveax has collected her published columns in book form, resulting in her 2 Mad Economist books. The first of these, Sex, Lies and Stereotypes, investigates relationships between sex and politics, economics and race. The argument Dr. Malveax develops here, that our ongoing American struggles over race and gender are primarily based in economics, is further elaborated in subsequent books, including her most recent one, Unfinished Business, the 10 most important issues women face today. This volume takes the form of a debate between Dr. Malveax, who presents the so-called liberal end of the spectrum, and Deborah Perry, an outspoken conservative. What sets Dr. Malveax's writing apart is her use of real people and real situations to illustrate her criticisms. To illustrate her point in Sex, Lies and Stereotypes, that the failure of inner-city schools is the fault of misappropriated fiscal priorities, she tells the story of her own friend, a teacher who is burned out by low salary, job instability, and disinterested students. Maintaining the same illustrative quality, she tells her own family story in Unfinished Business to shatter our contemporary nostalgia for the supposed close-knit, intertwined communities of the 1950s, where stay-at-home moms supposedly looked out for each and every neighborhood kid. Julianne's mom did not fit that mold. As a single mother of 5, she worked at the post office after a divorce, since it paid better than the teaching she was accustomed to doing. As the oldest child, Julianne had to wake up at 4 a.m. to lock the door behind her mom when she left for work. No wonder the model of family Dr. Malveax embraces is decidedly non-traditional, as described in a book by Marshall Miller, co-founder of the Alternatives to Marriage Project. Diverse families, including step-families, single-parent families, gay, lesbian, and transgender families, and unmarried cohabitors are here to stay. It is in this context that I imagine Dr. Malveax will today address the issues of motherhood. However, as Mary A. Kay noted in The Progressive, Dr. Malveax can be absolutely unpredictable when she takes a stance on an issue. Woe unto those who get their exercise leaping to conclusions about where Malveax will come down, she warned. Before we find out what Dr. Malveax has to say on today's topic, I want to mention one more aspect of her life work, one that did not make it into her self-description. Dr. Malveax is a formidable social activist. She has contributed her time and expertise to a number of civic, civil rights, political, and women's organizations, while quietly working for social change as a member of the board of directors of the National Child Labor Committee, American Economics Association, National Economics Association, Bay Area Association of Black Journalists, and Delta Sigma Theta. She often publicly speaks her frustration at the slowness of social change and what she describes as the backlash in terms of the new racism, sexism, and classism. In the summer of 2002, she triggered a vehement debate in the press by her declaration that she doesn't celebrate the 4th of July. Speaking on CNN's late edition, she said, "I get up in the morning and read Frederick Douglass's The Meaning of the 4th of July to the Negro, and then I grouse for the rest of the day." Frederick Douglass gave his historic speech on July the 5th, 1852, more than a decade before slavery would be abolished nationally. "This 4th of July is yours, not mine," Douglass said. "You may rejoice. I must mourn." Today, Julianne Malveax upholds Douglas's principle that no single individual can celebrate her freedoms and benefits when they do not yet extend to all citizens. Julianne Malveax's declaration about how she spends the 4th of July sent me back to Douglas's speech. I was not surprised to discover that in her relentless advocacy for universal social justice, Dr. Malveax sounds uncannily like the voice of conscience which Frederick Douglass invoked over 150 years ago. At a time like this, Douglass proclaimed, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. Dr. Malveax.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good
She went back down memory lane for me just a little bit. I don't think I've described myself as a poet for a while. But actually did begin as a writer, as a poet, and was actually Essence Magazine's first college editor because of a poem that I wrote called Black Love is a Bitter Sweetness. Wow, that was a long time ago, but thank you for that. I've never had such a comprehensive and flattering introduction, and I really appreciate it. I'm really delighted to be here. Some of you remember that this is not my first trip to the University of Utah. Somebody didn't show up or couldn't come at the last minute about 6 years ago, and blessedly, they found me. Blessedly for everyone, I was in the neighborhood, I think. I'm not sure, but anyway, I had a great time then, and so it was nostalgic to be able to come back. This is also just such an important time for us to stop and celebrate women, and congratulations on your award. It's always great to see a sister who has taken time and given, and that so many people poured out so much love for you. I think we forget, with the intensity of the movement, that often we forget to just stop and acknowledge people and that which they've done. And just give this woman another hand, if you would. To tell you, Herta, that I was very, very challenged by your theme this week for any number of reasons. We shared a little bit as we were coming over in the car last evening. My best friend is a Harvard law grad who stopped out of work for 8 years, and she gives me permission to tell her stories from time to time. My favorite story of hers, she calls me one day. I'm in this high-level meeting and my cell phone rings, and she says, I'm going to kill a bobblehead. Well, bobbleheads are the women. She lives in Alpharetta, Georgia, which is a suburb of Atlanta. And it's a relatively wealthy suburb. They have all these McMansions and big old houses and everything. In her particular division, they have these men who seem to have married their first wives' baby sisters. In other words, you go to some of their houses and you see the pictures, and it's like, oh, that's your other wife. They look alike. Many of them have been surgically enhanced, and they tend to be quite young. Cheryl is in her mid-40s, and so she's encountering women in their mid to late 20s, but Cheryl, my godchild, is 10, and the sister's 7, so she's got women who are doing the same thing she's doing, but they're 10 to 15 years younger. So one of the bobbleheads explained to her, and I know it's not nice to objectify folks, but when you see these women coming, I mean, you sort of see them coming, you know what I mean, first. And their heads are sort of like, they're trying to keep balance. So one of the bobbleheads explained to her that she didn't know how to use scissors, and then very gently took her hand and tried to show her how to cut. Now, this is a Harvard law grad who was a managing partner of a law firm in San Francisco before she decided that it was her husband's turn to get the job and all these challenges that women face. So the bobblehead is teaching her how to use scissors, and she said, I had a meltdown. I said, what did she do? She said, I used some of your language and explained to her, which would have been incendiary, and explained to her what my qualifications were. I said, your qualifications, Cheryl, for scissors? She said, well, but so literally a good portion of my time is spent talking to her about some of the challenges, and some days we sort of, I don't know that we envy each other's lives, because as I said to her, I've never really wanted children. I always wanted godchildren and nephews and folks, but I never really wanted children. The story you read about my mom is the case. I mean, it wasn't a horrible childhood. We had a lot of fun. But the fact is that having 4 younger siblings, it made it clear to me that was cool. From time to time, I would say to people, I mean, I had this habit in my 20s of getting engaged. I did it like 7 or 8 times. And then I realized I really didn't want to get married either. But, social pressure is kind of interesting. So, you date someone long enough, you figure, okay, I guess I better marry him. What else am I going to do with him? And then, but God is good. He saved me from all those pretty decent guys, actually. But in any case, after this spate of serial engagements, I said, I think I just better stop this. It's not good for them, not good for me. Plus, I'd hawked a few of the rings to go to Africa, and that didn't go over very well either. But, although it's not an envy kind of thing with Cheryl and I, but she tells me these stories, I'm like, gosh. Then there's this literature out there that I not kindly call, I will admit it's unkind, what I call the whining white women's literature. Anne Crittenden, The Price of Motherhood. She sort of whines her. It's a brilliant book on one level, but on the other level, there's no diversity in it. And there's also a point of whine. It's not fair. It's not fair. It's not fair. Or Sylvia Ann Hewlett is my favorite person to pick on, who wrote a book explaining that it really wasn't fair that you couldn't have children when you were 50. You're like, duh. Did high school biology elude you? Like, there's a time period, and you go around, you get this time period, maybe 15 to about 44. If you've blown it by then, you've just blown it. Adopt, why don't you? Do something, go volunteer at a daycare center. Don't write a book about why it's not fair that you forgot to have children. It wasn't on your memo pad. It just sort of slipped your mind, and now public policy is supposed to address that. And I've been saying to Cheryl forever, Cheryl, you've got to write one of these books because there are an increasing number of African-American stay-at-home moms who I think have a different set of dilemmas. For them, as opposed to the dilemmas of it's not fair, it's the dilemma of guilt. What happens when you come from a community that has such pressing needs? You have the education that the entire community fought for you to have. You've gone to Harvard or MIT or Yale because people sacrificed and put it on the line. And now you want to stay home? What's wrong with you? Aren't there enough? And literally you hear this guilt and angst from these women raising questions that I think we haven't answered in public policy. So I keep every day, this morning we talked, she said, I wish I was going to be there. What are you going to say? I said, I'll tell you about it later. But in any case, every day we have one of these conversations about just the juggle. And she is phenomenally blessed, really blessed to have a husband who has the income that she can stay home. So many women don't have that blessing. They have to do both. And so as women, we find ourselves all over the place. But while we are all over the place on one hand, on the other hand, in Western culture, motherhood has this iconic status. It's like the Trump card. I love Nancy Pelosi. She was my congresswoman when I was in San Francisco. But I have to tell you, I was a little turned off by the notion that she could manage Congress because she's also a grandmother. I know some grandmothers who don't need to be within spitting distance of Congress. But that's like the Trump card. Oh, I know how to do this because I multitask because I was a mother. You hear people saying as if motherhood is the proxy for compassion. After all, I'm a mother. The most recent big flap that truly irritated me, and this is the only time, I promise you, in my whole entire lifetime, that you will get me to defend Condoleezza Rice. And it was when she and Barbara Boxer, who again is one of my favorite people, we worked together in San Francisco politics, but Boxer was scolding Condoleezza, as well she should have been, about our Iraq policy, but then took it a little far. She said, well, after all, you have no immediate family. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Can you only make public policy if your ovaries have been proven to work? That does not make any sense. There are many people who don't have immediate family. And Condoleezza held her tongue, I wish she hadn't, but then later said, well, I thought that all of us who are Americans care about what's happening. Now, we may dispute her war policy, and indeed I do. But if we decide that having children is your trump card to making policy, who all will we be excluding? Let me tell you who we'll be excluding. Among them, me. But not just me. There are 44% of women aged 15 to 44 have never had children. Now, 15, we're happy about that. But when we slice it even thinner and look at the end of the birth cycle, women who are between 40 and 44, 19.3% of American women, 40 to 44, have never had a child. And it means they probably won't. And I mean, well, some of these people would like to spend their entire net worth and that of 20 other people trying to, conceive at 40, and I'm not mad at them. Just don't try to use Medicare money for that. But when you parse those numbers up, for African American women, it's 21.3%. For Latino women, it's lowest at 13.8 or so percent. For white and for Asian women, it's 17%, and for white women, it's about 17%. So basically, rounding it, 1 in 5 women is not a mother. What does that mean? Does that mean we have different voices? Does it mean that we should be silent? Does it mean that when we talk about nurturing, that we're not there? There's a psychiatrist who has a website called the No Kids Project. She said that she noted when in her psychiatric training, that people often thought that the mother relationship was the pivotal relationship to teach you how to manage people. And therefore, women who were single and psychiatrists suffered and faced some stigma. But it's not only women who are single and psychiatrists. I am over 50. And to this people say to me, don't you want any children? I said, let me explain something to you. It has been documented that I have a relatively high IQ, which means that I have good sense. Even when this is measured by European standards, I seem to be able to pass these tests. And that suggests at least that I do multiple choice think, if nothing else. So if I thought I wanted kids, I could have figured out how to get them. It's a relatively simple process. In fact, I thought I should be congratulated because it wasn't 50-some years of celibacy that left me in this position. But instead, folks look at me and shake their head and say, oh, you poor thing. Not at all. It was a joyful choice that I made, and a joyful choice that many people make. And then for some, it's not a choice. They're infertile. And that's a reality. But many of these women learn to accommodate themselves to that. And they too should not be looked at as people to be pitied. Instead, I think that the women, I call us other mothers. I call us the other mother. And we are women who should be looked at and celebrated. Why? When my girlfriend Cheryl gets too tired to take care of my godchild, guess who comes down to Atlanta to babysit? And doesn't mind doing it and has a great time. And my godchild loves to see me coming, but he also loves to see me going. His mother and I have different behavioral standards. This morning I told him that he doesn't get up in the morning. He refuses to obey his alarm clock. And so this morning I told him, every time your sister has to wake you up, you have to give her $1. Because his little sister gets up. So every time your sister wakes you up, you have to pay her. Because it's ridiculous. You're older. He said, well, my clock is 30 minutes off. I said, well, if you know it's 30 minutes off, do the math. Subtract and get out of bed, boy. But in any case, we other mothers are godmothers. We're aunts. When my sister, who's a single mom of 2 boys, gets tired of her, they're young adults. When they were teens, they were in Washington at my house. And we don't mind that. It's enhancing, but there are other things that one can nurture besides a child. One can nurture a movement. You look at someone like a Gloria Steinem, childless by choice, and you wonder, would she have had the energy to put into our defining feminist movement if she had done many of those other things? You look at a Dr. Dorothy Irene Height, who still goes to work every day at 94 years old. And I don't know if anyone has seen a phenomenal musical on her life called If This Hat Can Talk. But in the first version of the musical, there was I'm not sure how much of this is fictional, how much was real, but there's a song in there, and Dr. Height will never tell us that a guy is kind of courting her, and then it gets a little more serious, and she sings a song, her character sings a song called I'm Married to the Movement. In other words, she was not prepared to take the relationship any further given that which she was doing. But I think we need to pay attention to that, and instead of stigmatizing women who've made choices, remind ourselves that the women's movement was supposed to be about women having choices, having an array of choices. And when we fail to honor that, we fail to honor our movement. But we women have a lot of work to do. We talk about how we sit in community together. Because it's not just women without children versus women with children. There are these mommy wars that go on in suburban America. Women who stay at home with their children versus those who do not. We women can find lots of ways to fight. Well, what we really need to be fighting is patriarchy. And patriarchy is a word that we need to use more often, because when we fail to talk about patriarchy, we behave as if our choices are what have put us in oppressed positions. But what else puts us in an oppressed position is this whole notion of using motherhood as a proxy for womanhood, which means that all women's issues then must come under the umbrella of being a mother. So that when you talk to many women and many who deal with women's policy, the first place they go is work and family issues. Now, work and family issues are phenomenally important. I want to talk about them. But I also want to caution us that we limit ourselves. We simply say that women's issues are work and family. I mean, when we hide behind this whole notion of iconic motherhood, it sidelines other extremely important women's public policy issues. We genuflect on this notion of the mother as all. Then we also dehumanize not only a woman who is not the mother, but the women who, because of their ability to carry a fetus, experience some interesting kinds of discrimination. South Carolina, drug-addicted woman is incarcerated for 6 months, not sent to rehab, which incidentally works, but incarcerated because she ran the risk of giving birth to a drug-addicted baby. Well, Regina McKnight was her name. When she did give birth to the drug-addicted baby, which died, she was then prosecuted for second-degree manslaughter and incarcerated for 15 years for second-degree manslaughter. Now, in other words, we honored the fetus the woman was carrying more than we honored the woman, because if we had honored the woman, she would have been in rehab. Incarcerating people is an ineffective way to make them drug-free. In fact, you can get better drugs in many jails than you can get on the street. I don't know this for a fact, but I've been told. But when you think about the use of the fetus as a way to dehumanize this woman, it is a function of the way that we do this thing around iconic motherhood. What's even more important in the Regina McKnight case is the implicit racism involved in her incarceration. Had she been a suburban white mother with a private doctor, not a woman who had gone to a public health clinic, the addiction would have been hidden. It would not have been public. No district attorney would have rushed in to make an example and make his career on this woman. Some people do what they do in the dark and no one ever knows, but people who must go to public institutions, all of their deeds come to light, and the public then gets to weigh in. Also uneven, what was the woman in Texas who drowned her children? No one could believe she did this. She was, after all, a mother. Katie Couric opined, she must have been depressed. Okay. I would probably concur with that at the very minimum. Few looked at her husband. How did this woman get pregnant? It wasn't immaculate conception. When it was 5 or 7 children in a 6-year period, somebody needed to find something to prevent that process. You know, the man knew the woman was overwhelmed. Why was there no help? But the sympathy this woman got, again, was about this notion of iconic motherhood, which I have to tell you has a racial lens. The mothers we hold up are often white. We are not looking at women of color through that same lens. We have not heard people. I'll tell you about a letter I got, which is insane. Insane. A 12-year-old boy in Washington, actually in Prince George's County, Maryland, just died 2 Sundays ago from an abscessed tooth that turned bad. His family had been put off Medicaid. They had been living in a shelter, and this is a horrible story. His mother had taken the child to dentists, and they had turned him away because they didn't have the appropriate medical insurance. When they finally got him under control, the abscess had spread, and he died of a brain injury. So I wrote a column about it, and it appeared in some papers around the country. And this morning, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, when I'm still on East Coast time and playing with the internet, I'm addicted. Someone told me I was going to jail. I said, well, could I? I wouldn't mind jail. Orange is my favorite color. I would prefer cashmere to cotton, but orange is my favorite color. I said, but do they have wireless in the jail? I just want to know if they have wireless, I could probably finish my latest manuscript. 3 or 4 months away. They said, oh no, that's not what we were talking about. So okay, well then let's negotiate this. But in any case, I get this letter from someone 3 in the morning, and the letter says this tragedy could have been prevented if his stupid mother, direct quote, stupid mother, had simply bought him a toothbrush and some toothpaste. Well, first of all, after this happened, I called my dentist. I'm like, how does one get an abscess? He said, well, dental hygiene is part of it, but it's not the only part of it. You can get an abscess any kind of way. So and the woman went on to say, this woman should be prosecuted for child neglect. I sent her back a note. I said, I'm always amazed by the ignorance that pervades in America. See, my assistants don't let me respond to my email because I always they said, thank you for writing. She appreciates your input. I always have something else to say, so they're going to be mad when they look and say she answered email. We're in trouble, because invariably you call someone ignorant, they're going to write you back and call you something. Then eventually, it's another feud, one of those headline generating, But she believed the woman should be prosecuted for child neglect. Again, putting women, mothers, on pedestals on one hand, denigrating them and reducing them only to child care people on the other, essentially dehumanizes us. And we women have to fight for the multiplicity of roles of women and make sure that, especially when we're talking about mothers, that we don't talk about them only as mothers, they're also people. And when we talk about nurturing, we don't allow people to use that trump card of I'm a mother. Cindy Sheehan on one hand and Tammy Drought on the other, and I love Cindy Sheehan. But her claim to policy fame is I'm a mother. Well, her claim to policy fame ought to be this is wrong. Iraq is wrong, not because she's a mother, but because it's simply wrong. We lost 3,000 people, and we can't figure out why. We were looking for Osama, and we found Saddam, and it didn't even rhyme, but we figured, why not? One could be a reasonable substitute for the other, and almost $1 trillion later, we still haven't found the weapons of mass destruction that I think they said they never had, but they had bad intelligence. That's an understatement, at the very minimum. But in any case, how does motherhood get you in the debate? It ought to be principle that gets you in the debate. When you come into the debate because of motherhood, what Cindy Sheehan was unfortunately able to, or that I wouldn't say able to do, but what happened is that then other mothers were able to come in. The Tammy Drought on the other side to say, I'm a mother and I disagree. So then it's which mother trumps which mother. So that's anyone can say, I'm a mother. So which mother trumps which mother? So in any case, my first plea here is for us to really think about valuing women's choices and making sure that we deal with multiplicity. My second point that I'd like to make is to talk about motherhood and public policy. See, if motherhood has an iconic status, how does that show up, especially in the workplace? If, in theory, we are going to lift up motherhood as a sacred thing, does that show up in terms of family-friendly labor market policy? I would argue that it doesn't, and I think that anyone can look at what we see with labor market policy and argue that as well. 47% of all Americans, mostly people who earn low wages, that's women, have no paid sick leave mandated. 47% of all Americans. Can you believe that? I mean, if you work for federal, state, or local government, you probably have sick leave. If you are unionized, you probably have sick leave. But if you're in the private sector, you're just as likely to have it as not. That is amazing. So people who are at the bottom of the income distribution, who are barely making it anyway, make the choice between whether to go to work and infect everybody else. Presentism, there's something that human resource managers call presentism, as opposed to absenteeism. Presentism costs us perhaps $255 billion a year in terms of the infections. In other words, a person with a cold comes to work and sneezes on everybody. Now everybody has a cold, which cycles its way through. So presentism has a cost, but we don't pay attention to that. I bring up the sick leave because it's something we all must think about. Even when you have sick leave for individuals, most sick leave policies do not allow you to take time off to care for your children. So basically then you have to lie. You have to say you're sick when really it's your child that's sick. So we deify motherhood, but 60% of all mothers with children under 3 are in the labor force, and we have no accommodations for them. Only 3% of Fortune 500 companies make any child care accommodations at all. Any. Now when I say any, here's what I mean. It could be as much as an on-site child care center. That's a good thing. It can be as little as a hotline or referral service. Many companies have emergency child care, so you have to have your own regular child care, but if the babysitter gets sick, maybe you can do something about that. Most arrangements are informal. Unfortunately, when you survey women, the women who are more likely to get accommodations are the ones who are further up the ladder. So the executive vice president at a Fortune 500 company may have figured out a way to work something out. But what about the mid-manager 3 levels down who reports to her? Or more importantly, what about the clerical worker who doesn't have the income to make the changes that one might want to see made, the income to do the flexible kind of thing? It was amusing when the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts decided that her senior staff should be used to provide occasional child care for her twins because she couldn't find adequate child care. 2 of her senior staff people were mothers who had children as well. They didn't have the luxury of being able to bring their children into the workplace. Again, if we want to lift up motherhood, and we know that mothers have an economic necessity to work, and not only an economic necessity, let's face it, for some women, it's a creative necessity. You do not necessarily, I would probably be incarcerated by now, or at least institutionalized. If I had to stay at home with a child all day long, and the child had no vocabulary, I mean, I wouldn't even take my nephews until they could speak in complete sentences. I mean, Armand, the younger one, he carried a grudge against me for years. But I distinctly remember when he was 4, he came to my house, knocked on the refrigerator door and said, "Aunt Julianne, I want a sandwich." He hadn't said a sentence, and I looked at my sister. She said, "You said when he could speak a sentence, he could spend the night at your house." I said, "How long has he been practicing that?" So I was stuck. I had to keep him for the weekend. But in any case, this whole issue of who gets these family-friendly perks is one that we have to pay attention to. It's sick leave, it's flex time. For a brief moment in time, a bright and shining moment in the late 70s, the Carter White House had an initiative with flex time and job sharing. And it was a federal initiative, a phenomenal federal initiative to encourage workers in the labor market to experiment with these kinds of things. It lasted for about 2 years. There is no such official government policy anymore. Research suggests that informally people do this. Usually it comes from women who are thinking creatively, who go to their employer and say, "Here's the deal. Jane and I are going to share a job, and this is how we're going to do it." And the employer helps them tweak it. But there's no one who's saying these are the kind of things that we need to try. So it makes almost no sense. If we talked about family friendly, we would have to talk about our institutions in our society and the hours that they're open. Is having a child at school from, let's say, 8 to 3 sensible given the hours that mothers work? And again, class plays a huge role in how we play this one out. If you're Herta or me or a professor, you can decide, oh, well, on Wednesday I'll do this, on Tuesday I'll do that. If you have a clerical job, you don't get to tell your boss, on Tuesday I think I'll go to my child's school and see what's going on. Yeah, right. You try that too many Tuesdays and you won't have a job anymore. And so we need to look at the ways that teachers are available to young people, to parents, the ways that our institutions are open, even the way that banks and post offices are open, and what that means to working moms. But more importantly than that, we need to look at the whole issue of unpaid work and why we don't value that in our GDP, why the whole issue of caring falls by the wayside. And when I talk about family-friendly policies, let me be clear. We focus on children, but increasingly the sandwich generation has to focus also on aging parents. And where does that burden fall? While the financial burden among siblings, among children of aging parents, tends to be relatively shared, men paying about 20% more, but they make more, so that's okay. the caregiving, the actual physical caregiving burden falls on daughters and daughters-in-law by and large. That's who does the work. Some of these women do the work and they've withdrawn from the labor market. But others of them sandwich that work between taking care of their children and taking care of their parents. And it again is something the policy is not paying enough attention to. So when we talk about a family-friendly workplace, we want to talk about women and men having the ability to leave work because of family circumstances. Of course, you know, the economists would say that this is not a profit-maximizing proposition. I can hear them already. Every time I have this argument or debate with folks will say, well, how are we going to pay for it? But how do we not pay for it? Here's what amazes me about, for example, paid sick leave. The United States ranks 139th. I mean, our policies, Lesotho, we and Lesotho have the same. Lesotho, I mean, little bitty country that's surrounded by South Africa. Can't even get there without going to Joburg. Lesotho and the United States have the same family and leave policies. I mean, okay, why did I come up with that? It was an interesting fact. It was just such an interesting. I like Lesotho. You know, I mean, we often put ourselves out there as the most advanced country in the world, but then we look at our policies towards women and children, what we find is that we're not that advanced after all. So if we want to talk about motherhood from a policy perspective, what we have to acknowledge, frankly, is that there's a patriarchal notion of iconic motherhood that works against women. It works against women in terms of the way we deal with motherhood in public policy, but then it works against women, my third point, because it narrows our policy reach. So that we're only talking about children and childcare and family leave, and we're not talking about the other issues. The fact is that even when you don't have family-friendly issues, even when you don't have, a woman does not have children, sexism, plain old-fashioned, still living sexism contributes to the quality of a woman's work life. Sexism contributes to the quality of a woman's general life. We still have the Violence Against Women Act is going to be reauthorized this year. I would encourage all of you to make sure that your legislators know about this and know how important it is for us to continue that legislation. And I know I'm in Utah, and I know I'm not supposed to come here and politic, but I'm going to go home this evening. So it's all good. And while I'm at that, I must apologize to the state of Utah. I was on, post-Hurricane Katrina, I was on some television show, and they told me that they were sending black people to Utah. I said, why? I said, they don't have any black people in Utah. That's not right. And I think I got about 50 emails from black people who lived in Utah saying, excuse me, but I live in Utah. Why are you dissing me? Well, black people live everywhere. I mean, this is our nation, too. But you know, when Kathy talked about the many accomplishments of your women, I said, you know, I really owe Utah a little bit of an apology for that one. Just a little one. But anyway, when we allow motherhood to dictate public policy, what we end up doing is basically sidelining a whole other series of women's issues. And in the book Unfinished Business, I talk about the issues, Deborah Perry and I talk about the issues that are most important to women. Now, I have to tell you a little bit about this book just so you can, why did I end up writing a book with a Gen X white Republican? I have no idea. Temporary insanity. How did we do this book? At the end of the day, on separate continents. Literally. We got on each other's nerves in the process of writing the book so badly that she went to Italy and we emailed for 3 months. Deborah Perry and I met over impeachment. She was the designated Clinton hater, and I was a designated Clinton defender on a number of networks. The first time I saw her, I was stunned. In fact, I wrote that I realized that Republicans actually did value diversity because she was a brunette. If you look at the plethora of Republican pundits, you know, they all tend to be blonde, you know, rail thin, long hair, and they like to use their hair for punctuation. I thought commas worked better, but they make a point, you know. Ann Coulter, if you saw her with her ill-advised comments, I mean, she's like the little kid who knows they're wrong. You know, she says something really stupid, then she flings her hair and says, Like she's just waiting for someone to be outraged, And she knew she was wrong, The hair flip, she didn't fling her hair. She said, okay, fine. But in any case, I acknowledge that there was some Republican diversity in that Deborah Perry was a brunette, and she didn't have any pearls on. That was the second giveaway. So for about 6 months, we were paired together. Every day we were on somebody's television talking about impeachment. And we really did get sick of each other. But she also started working for Harris Wofford, who happens to be a hero of mine, when they want to reauthorize AmeriCorps. And the lesson there is Republicans have to know Democrats and Democrats have to know Republicans. You can't get legislation through without getting people on both sides of the aisle. And so she was able to help reauthorize AmeriCorps, which was phenomenal. It was a great thing to do. And in the process of that, we said, maybe we should do a book together. But we literally fought every step of the way. Now we're very good friends. She's the mother of twins out in California. And although I did decline being the godmother because I said I would like to be the godmother of the Democrat. And since we don't know which one is going to be the Democrat, I'm going to have to pass. Because if I had a godchild turned out like that, it wouldn't turn out right. But I did give her a baby shower. So we did become good friends, but the process of writing the book was painful. Here's why it was most painful. The publisher insisted that we have consensus on every single chapter. And we couldn't have consensus because we were too far apart. So, for example, in our education chapter, consensus was we believe in smaller classroom size. For reproductive rights, it was abortion should be depoliticized. We couldn't get much further past that. But we had to sit in a small room for a weekend and just say, we're going to come up with consensus because this book will never be published. The issues that we talked about in Unfinished Business, we were very careful to make sure that we didn't just talk about women's issues, even though they're important issues for women. In other words, we talk about work and family, but it's not first. Equal pay is first. Equal pay is more important than this juggling things. When women are paid equally, women can afford to have the same flexibility that men have. We still have a major pay gap. Deborah would explain it differently than I do, but the fact is that we have about a 28% pay gap, and it varies depending on occupation, industry, and region. And we seem to have a very, there seems to be no urgency about the pay gap. There seems to be no urgency, in fact, about the women's movement at all right now. We all seem to be sort of like, okay, well, we're mad about the war in Iraq, and some of us are disturbed about the economy, but the status of women and the treatment of women is something that we're just not agitated about anymore. And why not? Maybe we're tired of being agitated. Maybe people are burned out. But the other piece of it, I think that some of us have seen the gains and are a little bit complacent, and I don't think we should be. Even the gains that we have experienced are gains that can easily go away if we don't keep paying attention. So the equal pay issue is one of the most important issues. 30% of women work at poverty wages. 30% of women compared to about 18% of men. We can pull the jobs out that women do, although we've seen enormous change, especially at the boardroom level. What Catalyst, the research organization for women, points out is that even when we get women who are earning six figures, there's like a 30 to 40% pay differential. Now, I must say that part of the problem is women. We have a tendency to accept the first job offer we get. Someone says, here's $100,000, you're an MBA, and you say, I'm going to Disneyland. Here's what you're supposed to say. The three most powerful words in the English language are, is that all? So anytime someone offers you money, you're supposed to say, is that all? Now, if they truly don't have any more money, you won't get any more. But if they have a little something laying around, they'll say, well, what about, another couple grand? So is that all? But people have done studies of MBAs, some of the most savvy folks out there, and found that women MBAs are twice as likely to take their first offer as men are. Men are more likely to bargain. They like the job, they want the job, but they'll bargain. And so women have to check, we have to check ourselves, but we also have to be clear. Another issue with pay is when we talk about pay, we're all empowered. When you tell people how much money you make, we're all empowered. So in America, you're more likely to tell people how frequently you have sex. Than how much money you make. I mean, people have these conversations that are like too much information, and they share them with each other. Or you watch these television shows where Jerry Springer, I think, is off, I hope. But Dr. Phil is just about as bad, hidden cameras following people to see if they're cheating. Well, if you're going to do all that, follow the camera into the wallet to see how much money is in there. I mean, when we demystify money, and talk more about money, and women need to do this much more than men do, then we understand where the gaps are coming from. I had a sibling who worked for a state that will go unnamed. I think she signed a form that said I couldn't even mention her case. Yes, I can. They can't do anything to me, but that's all right. But anyway, when a secretary left because she didn't get a raise, she decided to print out the salary scale, the salaries of everyone in the office, and put it on my sister's desk. Now, the issue is that my sister was theoretically the third highest ranking pension fund investor, but she was making less than 6 men who reported to her. And she would not have known that had she not seen the salary. She said it never even would have occurred to her that there was these people ended up having to pay her 5 years' pay just to go away because it was that bad. But my point is that we need to talk about how much money we're making and demystify that. When you demystify it, women get more power. One of the other issues that I think we have to deal with when we talk about an important issue women face is education. While right now women are more likely to be enrolled in undergraduate school than men are, and in law school, in our nation's best law schools, women edge out men slightly in enrollment. It's not true at MBA, but it is true in law schools. So many would think, okay, we've solved all the problems for women in education. But when these women graduate, they don't get equal pay. That's one. But number two, which is interesting, is now there is a movement, which is to have affirmative action for men. Now, you try to eliminate affirmative action for people of color, but these poor men who are under-enrolled need help. And so we wonder now, if you really want to do affirmative action for men, try black men who are 32% of the African-American undergraduate enrolled. But that would be too much like right. So I've gone to spoken to several deans. I was just in Michigan, and the dean said, what do you think about an affirmative action program for the men? I said, well, I don't think it's a good idea. And he said, well, the men are under-enrolled. I said, well, create some incentives. They'll come back. But the education piece is important at the K through 12 level for women, especially young inner city women. What we pay teachers is a women's issue because women are more likely to be teachers. And the higher ed issue is going to be an issue for a very long time. Among other things, when you look at your tenured faculties, what you will find is a paucity of women, especially in the sciences and engineering. What you'll also find is that at your research universities, you're more likely to see the preponderance of men. If you get to community colleges going down, that's where you'll find the women. Who are the adjunct faculty? They tend to be women. This raises questions again about equity. The economy and taxes are women's issues. We pay taxes. We experience this economy. Many people do not want to look at the economy as a women's issue, but when we look at the ways that our tax system often determines people's workplace decisions, it's clear that we need to pay attention to the economy and taxes. And then to our safety net, to the safety net, Social Security, public assistance, and all of that. The fact is that because women live longer and earn less, we're more likely to be dependent at an older age. This goes across the board. Our Social Security laws have just been amended in the past 5 years. Carol Mosley Braun actually did this, so it's 7 years, to make sure that women were able to tap husband's Social Security if it was higher. And you can even tap it if you divorce the guy after 10 years. If his will be more than yours, you can still tap it. So that's a good thing. But there's so many more reforms that need to be done to make sure that women have a social safety net and that they have one in old age. When I talk about safety nets, I want to take a minute for us to think when we talk about women and motherhood about the biases that exist when we talk about public assistance. Public assistance has been eliminated as we know it. Bill Clinton promised to do that. It was probably one of his most shameful moments. So you don't have aid to families with dependent children anymore. You have something called TANF, Temporary Aid to Needy Families. It has, in the maximum case, a 5-year window. In some states, as short as 15 to 21 months. What happens after you graduate from TANF? You can get in-kind services, but not cash. And there are enormous red tape involved in getting those in-kind services. In a recent study of the people called extremely poor, there are about 30 million Americans who live in extreme poverty, which means they live at half of the poverty line. $9,900 for a family of 4. How do you do that? You have a minimum wage job and you're off 2 weeks with that unpaid sick leave that I mentioned. So if you don't work 52 weeks but 50, you end up at about the $9,900 mark. $5,000 for an individual. But among those people on extreme poverty, only a third of them are receiving food stamps, although they're all entitled to it. So the question is, why aren't they receiving food stamps? Now, what we have to look at, the history, we talk about a safety net, is the history of how we began to shred the safety net, and it's about those imagery and motherhood and race and class. Recall that moment in 1996 when a member of Congress stood up and said he would rather, there were women on public assistance who he wouldn't leave his cat with. He said that these women were poor mothers. Why were they poor mothers? Simply because they were poor. The access that they had to any number of goods and services was not the same access that a middle-class woman would have. But we still see racial bias in the public assistance programs today. Let me tell you how. In one study where going to school, pursuing a nursing degree, going to higher education can be an approved activity. It is not a defined approved activity, but it can be. No African American women in a particular Virginia county, no, not a single one, was given a waiver for higher education. In that same county, 12% of the white women who requested the waiver received it. No African American women received the waiver. In this particular county as well, nearly 30% of the African American women had sanctions imposed on them for some form of aberrant behavior, not following the rules. No white woman in this county, not a single white woman, was sanctioned. Now, one might say, well, the white women behaved and the black women didn't. But what you have to look is the lens of the social worker and the assumptions that were there. We have some work to do in terms of our attitudes toward poor women. I happen to think that women who are poor and have children and manage are, quite frankly, far more economically skilled than someone like me with an advanced degree in economics. How do you figure out? How do you figure out how to make $10,000? If you're a minimum wage worker, how do you make $10,000 a year stretch over children? And some of us are patting ourselves on the back. The Democrats raised the minimum wage. Well, the Senate, the House passed it, the Senate hasn't approved it yet, and it won't go into effect until next year. So it'll go into effect the first step 60 days after it passes, and I don't know when they're going to get around to passing that. So while people are patting themselves on the back, we still have a lot of work to do around that wage. I'm just going through these top issues because I want us to think about them and about what we miss out when we only talk about work and family and motherhood. The whole issue of crime and violence is an issue that hits street crime, hits women more heavy than it does men. We're more vulnerable. We just saw the mugging in New York, a 101-year-old woman being mugged. It was just totally amazing. So we have to begin to talk about our vulnerability as women and what that means and how laws should be enforced. But at the same time, we have to parse that and talk about unfairness in law enforcement and why some women of color have ambivalence about bringing law enforcement in, even when you're talking about domestic violence. Because all too often, what women of color know is that the law is enforced unevenly. Race is a woman's issue. My dear friend and colleague, Dr. Janetta Cole, wrote a piece in Good Housekeeping magazine about 12 years ago in which she talked about the special responsibility women have to deal with racial issues. Because women bring different kinds of energy, I think, to the table often. Because women see it playing out with their children. Because we can have a dialogue, we often see women have a dialogue that men have not been able to have. And because we see the microcosm, not the macro issues of race, how it affects us every day. So we women have much work to do around race matters. The reproductive issue, I understand, is a hot issue here in Utah as your legislature just considered repealing abortion laws. This morning, you all had arranged for me to do a radio interview with a gentleman who asked me what would happen if Roe were repealed, and I said, well, there would be the revolution. We keep pushing to say, when are women going to have a revolution? Well, women aren't going to have a revolution. It's an evolution. But if you repealed Roe, I think that you might see something of a revolution. You have generations of women who've grown up, and they didn't know anything but Roe. They might not like abortion. Nobody does. But they knew that it was an option that they had. Take that option away and galvanize women. I don't think the Supreme Court would ever eliminate Roe. Here's what I think they've been doing. They've been chipping away at it. So instead of taking away your right to choose, you have a parental notification, you have a 24-hour waiting period. When you impose a 24-hour waiting period in the rural South, you impose a ridiculous economic burden on women. In other words, in some states you've got one abortion clinic that's hours away, or maybe a day's journey away. So you've got to go, then sleep somewhere, or go back home and come back. So you literally are saying to women, you've got to pay implicitly $200, $300, $500 to get an abortion. not to Planned Parenthood, but to the cost of dealing with that. And so we see the right to choose being chipped away. We also see a whole set of reproductive research being suppressed because of the funding that is not available because of the conservatism of some of the folks who are making public policy. Women cannot stop talking about reproductive freedom and reproductive rights, but we have to talk about these things past abortion. Abortion is a polarizer, but the whole notion of health knowledge is important. When you look at the whole issue right now with the human papillomavirus and the Gardasil that Merck has been manufacturing, it's an issue about which I have many mixed feelings, but at the end of the day feel that the inoculation makes good sense. If you can keep people from basically developing cervical cancer, why not do that? I mean, I've seen the economics of it. Someone told me it costs about $130,000 a person, but it's actually $130,000 for a person who would have gotten the cancer. It's not $130,000 per person. It costs about $400 a person, which does mean that Merck would stand to make about $4 billion, and I think that's part of the problem. In the African American community, part of the problem is that we have been medical experimented, basically the subject of medical experiments all the time we've been here. And so many people are paranoid. What does this mean? Maybe we should test a little bit longer. But what we know is that this vaccination is not a free pass for sex. It doesn't prevent other sexually transmitted diseases. It prevents cervical cancer. But again, we have allowed, whatever your beliefs are, there's also science. Whatever you believe about sex and sexuality, whatever your family values about that are, there are also scientific issues, and we know that there are people who have been celibate, who have gotten cervical cancer. So there's not necessarily a connection between early sexual activity and cervical cancer. We have to be able to talk about these issues a bit more clearly. And Deborah Perry and I picked our top 10 issues that women face. The other two that we dealt with were issues that people said, are these really women's issues? But foreign policy and globalization is a woman's issue. It's a woman's issue for any number of reasons. Notwithstanding the war in Iraq, the treatment of women around the world is a function of some of the things that we're doing here in the United States. When you look to the African continent, I do some work with people in Liberia, and there, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who you want to talk about motherhood and its contradictions, this woman has two nicknames. One is Mama Ellen, and the other is the Iron Lady. Just imagine just the distance between those two things. People are very affectionate about her because she's a mother. They feel that she cares about them, but they understand that she is a total, no-nonsense, if not ruthless, politician. There are a generation of young people in Liberia who have never been to school because the country has been at war for 25 years. A generation of young people who've never been to school. And we know that just 1 year of education for girls, just 1 year, improves infant mortality, improves nutrition standards, increases the rate at which that woman's children will go to school. We have decided in our wisdom that we spend our foreign aid dollars, we prefer to spend our foreign aid dollars on aggression than we do in the kind of helping that we've done in the past. And so when we talk about foreign policy and globalization, there are a range of issues that are women's issues, and then there are issues because. It was just a recent, I know that all of you covered an expose of Walter Reed Hospital and how our soldiers are not getting adequate care. One of the things that struck me is that we have had over 80 women die in the war in Iraq, and we've had nearly 2,000 women's casualties that have looked just like these catastrophic male casualties with multiple limb loss, half of a face blown out. The Washington Post and the New York Times did phenomenal jobs of featuring soldiers, but not a woman soldier was featured. Of course, we know about Tammy Duckworth and her phenomenal campaign. And can you imagine that this veteran who lost a leg was demonized by the right because she's a Democrat? I mean, there's no other reason, really. She's even good on the war issue for them, but she's a Democrat. But in any case, this is a case with foreign policy and globalization that I suggest we see the world through a gendered lens. When we see the world through a gendered lens, we raise a series of issues. And then finally, the issue that Deborah and I put on that we both felt strongly about and our publisher didn't, but we fought it through, was the environment. Why is the environment a women's issue? Because all issues are women's issues, because we breathe air, because we live here, because global warming affects us, because it's important, because we want our children and our families to know about the continuum of life. And in order to know about that continuum, we have to pay attention to the environment. Rachel Carson would be 100. I guess it was like last week, and she was one of the women who paid so much attention to our environment and what we're doing to our earth. There's so much more work there that needs to be done. Again, when we decide that we only focus on motherhood, on work and family issues, we leave all those issues out. I remember the Jimmy Carter Commission on the Status of Women, on which Bella Abzug was on. It was a phenomenal commission, and it was disbanded. If you remember the war in Iraq, it takes me down memory lane. The war in Iraq had begun. We had the troops were beginning to go over there, and Bella wanted to make a statement about that. And Jimmy Carter said, no, that's not a woman's issue. You can't issue a statement on Iraq. If you do that, we'll disband the commission. And she, with her phenomenal hats and all her energy, said, every issue is a woman's issue. And every issue is. Yes, we embrace motherhood. We have to. Motherhood is about the bridge over which, we bring forth new life. But every woman doesn't choose that. And even mothers must not choose their motherhood identity exclusively. When mothers decide that motherhood is a trump card, that it comes into conversation simply because there was childbearing, mothers are wrong. And women lose when mothers decide to focus on a narrow range of issues as opposed to a broad one. I am so glad that Herta talked about Frederick Douglass, who is one of my favorite people, really. Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois. Now, if those brothers were alive, I might have had a chance at getting married. Might have. But they were both, promiscuous, so it wouldn't have turned out right. But one of the things that Douglass said that I think we women should always bring to the table when we think about power and women and patriarchy, he said power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Those who want freedom without agitation are like those who want the ocean without its mighty roar. The point for women is this. We know that we live in a patriarchy that has yet to be dismantled and probably never will be, which means our fight will never be over. At the same time, we know we have the backbone to fight. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I am told by Leo that we have some time for questions, and there's a mic right there if anyone wants to raise a question or maybe engage in some dialogue. And I guess Leo will tell me when it's time to stop. Is that, yeah. And so the mic is there, and anyone is welcome. And all y'all leaving, I'm not going to take it personally. I'm going to assume you're going to class.
Hi, I was going to try to organize my thoughts since the one was coming up. Thank you for coming, and I'm from California, so...
Are you Pat Ford's friend? Are you Pat Ford's friend? No? Oh, I am. Oh, you are? Okay. A friend of mine told me a friend of hers was coming, so...
So anyway, I can relate a lot to what's happening back there. There's so many things that you touched on that I wanted to try and kind of explicate some of the things I think for the people, the audience that you have. The thing that you talked about, saying what your salary is, that happened to me, 30 years ago in San Francisco. And a Jewish woman came to me. She was concerned, we're working in a law firm. She was concerned about her salary. She told me she was making more than I was making. We were doing the same thing, had the exact same. She was in graduate school, I was in graduate school, And so, I had to go home so I could be a lady. I finished my day, and I didn't say anything, which is not like me. But I came to the next day and went straight to the manager's office and made him give me my pay at least, But we would not have known that because people don't talk about pay. No. So I think that women, you need to talk about pay so you can find out what is really going on, like that happened. So that was one thing that has happened in my life. The other thing, when you were talking about teachers, and I think it was your mom that couldn't teach because she couldn't make enough money to pay her things.
Well, she worked at the post office for a while because teaching didn't pay enough.
And the same thing is happening now. So whereas I do want to go back and teach, because I love teaching. It's not work. It's the extension of my motherhood thing, which I have a disagreement on that. But anyway, I love teaching, but I can't afford it. I simply cannot. The money, finite money issues have, now thinking about, I really can't do that, at least for a while. So those issues, and that goes right into the equal pay. That we as women accept this insanity of all the work that we have to do, but we don't get paid for it. We simply allow it to continue year after year. And it goes back to not making that demand. So anyway, I just want to let you know that you really did touch on a lot of things that were very important. And they're small things, but that can be done. But we kind of like go along. But I did want to say that the major thing that I'm having total stress about is that we as women must not simply continue to do what men do. We're not trying to be equal to men, like as a black person way back in the 15. I'm not trying to be equal to white people. God has already ordained that. But so that the policies and things that we do don't have to be the same. When I worked in another law firm, I was a white woman who was the manager. I was able to bring my baby. So, I mean, I didn't care what I got paid, basically, because I knew that my child, what I wanted for my child, was that at least that bonding. So for 5 or 6 months, I had an office, I had a bathroom in my office, I had the whole thing. So I was able to do my work with my child there, So we have to do things that work. We have to feminize it, So anyway,
I love that last point. I wrote a piece years ago where the analogy I use is whether women want a bigger piece of pie or a different kind of pie. I mean, it's slicing the pie or changing the recipe was the title of the piece. And because the issue is, men benefit when we talk about some of these policies as well. Men have aging parents too. They'd probably like to be able to spend some time with aging parents, but that's not a workplace policy. But too many women, I believe, have bought the hype of the dream as it is. I did some diversity work for a Fortune 50 company. I do that from time to time, and everybody always gets frustrated, but it always starts out beautifully. And at this particular company, part of the assignment was for myself and my partner, who's a white male, to my partner in this particular enterprise, that is, be clear, but was to interview the top 50 corporate officers, and then we interviewed like the top 20 African American officers. They had like 3 Latinos, interviewed all 3 of the Latinos, but in any case, the 2 top ranking women had totally opposite approaches to women's issues and to diversity issues. One of them was one of these hard-charging, she ended up going to work for Bill Clinton at some point, but hard-charging, no-nonsense. At the time, she was probably 43 or 4. She had 2 children. She'd married late. And she'd done everything, no drama, no trauma. And she said, I could do it. Everybody else ought to be able to do it. I never came in here whining about my children being sick. Well, she had 2 live-ins. Not 1, but 2. Her husband was wealthy, and she was making 6 figures, and they had 2 people living in their house. So no, she didn't have to come in whining when her child was sick. And she just had no give. She's like, women have to do it by the rules. They have to do it by the book. She told me, I don't believe in this diversity crap. And I'm like, okay, we write that down too. But she'd been very successful. Now, the other woman, who people described as soft, but who was on the executive committee of the corporation, so she was one of the top 5. She wasn't number 2, as this one of the top 5, and she basically bent over backwards to try to figure out how to make it work. Her attitude is, we've got good people here. We want to keep the good people here, so we've got to do what we can to keep people here. And literally, she moved human resources from one report line to her report line so she could have more influence on that, although her boss told her having human resources report to her undervalued her position in the corporation. Well, how does human resources, the most important thing, the people, how do you do the work without the people, undervalue your position in the corporation? But you have these 2 women with 2 diametrically opposed approaches to the workplace. And there are too many women who are like, let's do it by the book. And not enough women who let's try to figure out how to make it work. And it's not necessarily feminizing the workplace, it's humanizing the workplace, I think. Yep. You want to holler or you want to go to the mic?
My question is, you referred to Social Security and how women can now tap into their husband's Social Security if they needed to. What about those that aren't married? What would you do to change that policy?
Well, women who aren't married, basically, well, if they've never been married, it's their own earnings that become what their Social Security is based on. I mean, the theory behind allowing women to tap into spousal benefits is that those women at some point had stayed home to take care of the family.
Well, what about a gay partnership?
Well, first you have to get generals to stop running around talking about homosexual lifestyles. I mean, that would be a good start, you know. Frankly, I did the way that our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters are treated vis-a-vis public policy is shameful because their humanity is essentially systematically negated. But I am not optimistic at all that this Congress or any other Congress is going to deal with it. The education job that gay and lesbian folks have is sort of analogous to the education job that African American people had in the 50s and early 60s, is to make sure that other human beings understand their struggle, so that it doesn't become a gay struggle, but it becomes an American struggle. These are American people who have the same rights that basically everybody else does. So you saw this around September 11th. Domestic partnerships not recorded. If you lost a partner, you weren't able to get that compensation. And there were one or two cases, I think there was one where Hillary weighed in and one person in the couple was able to get the money, but by and large, these folks lost loved ones too. So that's a bigger issue than a Social Security issue. It's really an issue about tolerance for gay and lesbian people and their economic rights.
I'll shout if you don't mind. I think I can say this loudly enough. Wonderful remarks. Two of them struck me in particular, and I want to ask you about them. One is that the gains that have been made can be so easily lost. The other is your opinion that if Roe is overturned, it'll spark a revolution. I wonder, and there are some young women who have been living their entire lives during the period we call the backlash. Mm-hmm. What strategies or ideas do you have to try to energize them to see that these are their issues and to get them to be more proactive now rather than waiting until more of those gains are lost?
That's a great point. I think that we women who are boomers and beyond have dropped the ball. I mean, we have to deal with intergenerational power sharing in the women's movement. In the same sense that I don't expect to ever go in a room and see all white people or all men, we should never go in a room and see nobody under 30. If you go in that room and there's no one under 30, you have to ask, what's wrong with this picture? Did no one have a mentee that they could bring along? See, I think that when you find young women turned off, some of them are turned off because they're going to be turned off. Some of them are careerists or they're, too busy for their family. One of the things that Deborah and I found when we were working on Unfinished Business is a lot of women say they don't do politics because it turns them off because they don't like contention. And we have to sort of educate women around some of that. But one of the ways we do it is we bring them into the room. So that, because they're not going to listen to us, really. I mean, they'll hear us, but they're going to listen to their peers. I mean, it's like the unseemly nature of someone like me lecturing a rapper. Now, I do not like rappers by and large. I do not like the way they talk to women or about women. But you know what? I like some of them if they're clean. But for me it's irrelevant. I don't buy rap music. I don't dance to that mess. And I did say mess. But when the young women at Spelman College for Women said that Nellie couldn't come on their campus, when the young women said, that was when it became important. I think similarly, we can talk about Roe all we want and about choice all we want. We have to have young women talking about it. And they have to see the concrete examples, because it's not just, one of the things I thought would have been really galvanizing and was when now pharmacists don't have to fill prescriptions. I mean, they can decide that these are certain prescriptions that they won't fill. I thought that might be galvanizing for young women who might be on birth control to say, how many pharmacies do you have to shop around to before you, I mean, this is not morality, this is medication, that we're dealing with here. But, other than that, I'm as much of a loss as you are, but I think that one of the major gaps that I see is the whole issue of intergenerational leadership in the women's movement. There's so many of us who like the place at the table. And while no one is asking anyone to relinquish their place, certainly the whole notion of moving over and making room for some more chairs shouldn't be a foreign one for women. The gentleman is standing. And then this lady here who keeps trying to go to the microphone and then decides to...
I'm kind of doing the same thing, actually. But my question echoes a couple of the ideas in the last couple of questions you'd address. It's as the environment and war and such are women's issues. Women's issues are, of course, human issues. And I want to know your thoughts on how we can help get women's issues, to be seen more of an issue, get it away from an idea of an issue for you and me, as opposed to an issue for us, as opposed to how we can bring more people into the focus of women's issues within the overall struggle for social justice, including, of course, men. There's not very many men here. But the fact of the matter is, I'm sorry, I'm having a little problem with my thoughts, sorting my thoughts here, but including bringing more men into the struggle on the focus of women's rights within the overall struggle again. I keep having a hard time getting that exact train of thought. I apologize.
I kind of see where you're coming from.
Not just as supporters, but as full-fledged fighters. To be seen by themselves, by men, and by women within the struggle for women's rights.
I like that. I like that concept. Thanks for taking the time to develop it. I think about one of the authors that talked about that a lot was John Stoltenberg, male feminist refusing to be a man. So I think the challenge with what you're saying is that patriarchy is privilege. And when you start unpacking patriarchy, not many people are willing to give up privilege. I mean, theoretically they might be, but then when you parse it down to, does that mean that you're going to do more dishes? Does that mean that if the salary pot is $1 million and there are 10 people, that would be $100,000 a person, but you already make $400,000. So now if this salary pot is going to be equally divided, you got to give something up. Now, when that very tangible question is posed to you, you're like, ugh. You know, especially if it was money. I mean, the dishes you might, and I don't even know about that. I mean, so much work has been done on the division of housework. And when I look at friends who, live with people and share responsibilities, people's definition of share is very different. But in any case, I think, that the issue is unpacking patriarchy and beginning to talk about what patriarchy means and the issue of fairness. I think that's the steepness of the curve that we face, is that while many men theoretically believe in social justice, believe in fairness, they're comfortable. They're very comfortable. And even when we used to think that when executive men had daughters, that some of the issues that reverberate with unfairness, such as partnerships in law firms, might be dealt with differently. Hasn't really happened. I mean, some law firms now will let you, and some academic institutions will let you stop a clock for partnership or tenure, but not many. I mean, not the majority by any stretch of the imagination. But, there was this theory that, well, gee, when it affects the guy personally, then he'll personally get involved, and that really hasn't happened. So we need male evangelists. Maybe you're one of them. Male evangelists to basically make men feel as passionate about this as women do. But again, another piece of this is how many women really feel passionate about it. I mean, Biz Magazine did a survey about 10 years ago regarding affirmative action. And it was an affirmative action survey that talked about women. Didn't really talk about race. It talked about gender and looked at where women were. And I had the privilege of analyzing the data results for the published piece. And what struck me, they sent me this box of surveys, and they're handwritten, but they have coded too. But I want to look at the handwritten surveys because you always get interesting information. One woman wrote, well, what about the men? What about my son? So we're talking about affirmative action, equality for women, and she said, but what about the men? Well, I think many women also like traditional roles, also think that patriarchy provides something for them. Maybe it's protection, theoretically. But when you push some women, especially women in certain demographics, if they're part of the Christian right, if they're in parts of the South, they don't have a problem with the current division of labor. They don't have a problem with unequal pay. They're okay with it.
Maybe it would be more attractive to especially more younger women if it was posed as us together
think you're right, and I think that there are pivotal places where we can look at what we learned from the past in terms of the women's movement, things that might have been done differently. One of the brilliant campaigns was the Pay Equity campaign in San Jose, which happened in the early 80s. What was brilliant about it was that they talked about if women got pay equity, what it meant for families. In other words, it wasn't taking from men, but it was adding to families. If women are discriminated against, the argument was families have less money because most American families are two-earner families. And so that was the argument that got male unionists, the least likely people you might expect to embrace a notion of women's equality, involved in that. So it's certainly something to think about. It's a very provocative question.
I so much enjoyed your talk. It was so inspiring.
I think you're going to use the.
Oh, you want me to use my?
Yeah, because when you're talking forward, the voice is in here.
Well, anyway, this was marvelous and inspiring. I have two questions. You said race is a feminist issue. I'm a law professor and I write about work, family, and how we define families. And there's a real split among academics, at least in my field. The way white or people maybe privileged by race and class might see the solutions to those issues, and maybe critical race feminists, for example. And so my first question is, how do we get white women to take race seriously? And maybe this is probably a little bit unfair question to ask you, because maybe I should be asking white women that. But and then the second question I have is, you said that, because I find, just going back, that's been very challenging. And the second one is, a lot of young women, I think, say they're not involved. You said we need to have thunder and be aggressive and agitate, but I think there's a lot of fear, especially in the environment of backlash. And I think a lot of women say, I don't do politics, but really, I think we're afraid. So how do you deal with fear, and how do you deal with how do you get people to take race seriously in feminism?
Those are great questions. I think you're right about the fear. I think at the end of the day, although women may want equality or want fairness, which may or may not be equality, women also want families. They want certain quality of life. They don't want every political argument to seep into the dinner table or something like that. Deborah went up to New Hampshire when we were doing. I did some focus groups in Chicago and D.C., and she did some in New Hampshire at a Republican meeting, and she told me this hilarious about a woman who she asked her who she was going to vote for. It was before Bush had been, whatever, he was running for the nomination. That's difficult. Anyway, but in any case, the woman told her, she asked the woman in front of her husband, they talked about politics, she said, who are you going to vote for? And the woman said, come here. And took her to the corner and whispered in her ear. And she said, but don't tell my husband. And I'm like, oh my goodness. But so you have some of that kind of fear. And I'm not quite sure what you do about inherent fear, but I think that many women are radicalized when their circumstances change and they see that they have to step up. So I mean, I'm not answering your question. I'm just sort of thinking aloud. The issue with white women and race is just like the issue of men and women's issues. I mean, white women basically are comfortable. And you see it in a lot, ironically and frighteningly, you see it in a lot of corporate settings around diversity issues, where the chief diversity officer is often a white woman whose primary focus then is work and family, and how to get more women in, and there's a significant resistance to dealing with race and class, because it's race and class. She probably does not have a challenge dealing with professional African-American women like herself often, but when you start talking about going down the ladder a bit, there's a bit of discomfort. And basically, white women have to unpack that whole issue of racial privilege, of white skin privilege and what it means. And it's difficult because for them, they've been discriminated against by gender, but have not experienced the disadvantage that folks have experienced by race. So it's discrimination without disadvantage. And that makes white women the primary beneficiaries numerically of affirmative action, gives them a head start. They've had the same kind of educations that their brothers, nephews, sons, and fathers have had, and now the doors have been opened. And their job ought to be to keep doors open for others, but you just don't see that. You see it with some, but it really takes a long time. But the other thing that's interesting, I was just with the National Centers for Research on Women last week. They celebrated their 25th anniversary, and they had commissioned a poll to talk about how Americans felt about a progressive agenda, and found that, let me see if I have the list of issues that they said that they were likely to, women were likely to support candidates that cared about getting out of the war, cared about violence against women, the minimum wage, and there was one other issue. But women of color were the front runners here. So one of the things that I think that progressive white women certainly need to do is look at this group of women of color as allies. And when you begin to look at them as allies, it's not so much as unpacking race as it is, what can I do for you because I need you to do something for me. When we look at a progressive agenda, we will find African American women are the most loyal and dependable Democratic voters out there. 86% of us consistently vote Democrat. 86%. For men, it's in the 70s. So we're consistently, yeah, well, that too. But it's an interesting time. That looked at a couple of campaigns that came out of 2006. The Michael Steele race was very interesting. I mean, he didn't quite get what he thought he was going to get, but he scared Democrats significantly. And because basically African American men in particular were interested in seeing an African American man in that position, and they were interested in someone who talked the right game on minority business. Now, on everything else politically, Steele is wrong as rain. But on minority business issues, he comes down correctly. He comes down correctly in terms of minority set-asides, affirmative action, all that. So if you look at the state of Maryland, look at some of the economics, especially in a county like Prince George's, where you have a higher percentage of business ownership among African Americans than a lot of other places, that was very attractive. And so Democrats had to scramble, especially after having rebuffed Kwesi and Fume. So take it for granted on one hand, but some challenges on the other. Okay, I think that means I'm supposed to sit down. Thank you all very much.